Good morning, afternoon, evening, ladies and gentlemen. We're trying something new here today. One of our friends of the program made a musical rendition. We promised to use it, and we liked it. Didn't know exactly how it was going to go. This is our first time using it, but we are going to have that intro for a while at least to bring on the program.
I got his name up there too. It's called Adventure, and the composer and performer is David Mayton.
David Mayton, who doesn't live in the city anymore, but he's a resident, and he's a longtime admirer of the studio and also a supporter of the program. We want to make sure that we give him his props. The program is brought on here at allpointstv.com every week starting at 2 o'clock. We start exactly at 2 o'clock sharp and go from 2 to 3. And we precede the program called Satori's Black History Corner every second and fourth Mondays. And that'll be next week and then 2 weeks thereafter for that program this month. Always glad to be here with you and have you with us. And we hope to have a pretty good program today and hope you'll stay tuned for the next hour. I'm George Moss. I try to bring you something different on the #1 podcast studio here in Genesee County. And we try not to repeat the things that are being said elsewhere, and everyone else has their own pitch in terms of how they want to present their programs to the viewers. We like to try to do something just a little bit different and bring some different perspectives that maybe others have not looked at, although we do respect the other persons out there, because we are part of what I think is a necessary part of the information network that we have in the United States. And the alternative media, quite frankly, is providing a service that gets us away from having to take the laundry list of things that go on in the alphabet soup stations, such as well, you know all of them, the ones on cable and also the major networks, which give you their side of things. But we have another network right now, the engines we can use away from those networks that are FCC licensed. And we can bring another perspective from the fact that we're not controlled and we don't have to be licensed by the FCC in order to bring the narratives we bring to the American people and to the public. I do read these statistics that show that only 6% of the American people, only 6% of the American people believe that they can trust what is imported from the source, FCC sources, and that is no more true than it is right now, given what happened last week at the Democratic National Convention, where they had these theatrics going on, and I want to talk about that for the first part of the program at least, in terms of what occurred, particularly with this one person that got up there and gave his anti-Donald Trump tirade, I would call it. The one, his name is Khizr Kahn, and he's been making the news on a regular basis ever since he gave his speech. I think he must have spoken, was it Monday or Tuesday? But he was the one that just seemed to have had on his person, inside of his inside coat pocket, a copy of the Constitution. Now, I was first of all surprised he didn't pull out a copy of the Sharia law, but he had a copy of the Constitution. I'm sure he carries it around, and he was inviting Donald Trump. If he has not read the Constitution, he said he doesn't believe that Donald Trump has read the Constitution, but of course he's read it. And he whipped out a copy of it out of his inside coat pocket and said, Mr. Trump, you can borrow my Constitution if you don't have one, and was willing to let him read his Constitution, which I'm sure he has by his bedside, and reads it every day right before getting up in the morning and getting off into the public arena, or maybe at night, reading it before going to bed at night, right there by his bedside. And he wanted Donald Trump to know that he has read the Constitution, and we would like to know what provision of it that he was quoting in terms of that which would put the comments made by Donald Trump in check. I mean, Donald Trump has said America first, so I would like to know if that's found in the Constitution and contradicted anywhere where that claim of America being first should not be admonished by a candidate running for the President of the United States. not running for president of the world, but running for, as president of the United States. And where is it that that's abrogated in terms of the claim that we are? What does that song say by the group from Flint? We are the world. Well, we're not the world. We are the United States of America, and we have a hodgepodge of the constituents from around the world. But the world is outside of the 3 million plus square miles of boundary that make up the United States, the continuous 48 states, and the 2 states that do not touch the other 48 states, Alaska and Hawaii. And that is the United States. It's not the United States of the world, United States of America. And so this person stood up there, and I began to really, beam into and focus on him. When I saw the delivery and also the comments that he made, I began to watch him very carefully from that point. I did notice some things even as he was making his presentation, one of which was that his wife was standing on the sideline silent, and he was the one that was speaking for both of them. She did not have any words to say after her husband spoke, but she was on the stage, but as a silent partner. And of course the word would be that he was doing that because she was standing there because she just cannot keep from bawling when a picture of her son is shown. She just cannot keep it together, and which is a sexist way of looking at it. That her, excuse me, her husband is strong, but she is a woman not strong enough to see the images of her son without breaking down. But he can do so. And that had nothing to do, of course, with the sexism inside the Arab culture in terms of how the women ought to be on the sideline and not to speak in the presence of their husband when their husbands are acting in a formal way. They're not to, in fact, invade that space. Had nothing to do with that. It's just the fact she would have broken down if she had anything to say at the microphone. And of course, that was a comment was made after the presentation was made.
I'd like to know this though: why weren't the SEALs members or the Special Forces members' families invited on stage to talk at the same convention that Hillary was parading these people there? I mean, I'm sorry about the loss of their son. I mean, but then again, he did sign up for it. It's a voluntary military.
Yeah.
So he did sign up for it. Mm-hmm. So that's the reality of the thing. Mm-hmm. Another thing is too, but the people who were trying to get help from then Secretary of State during the Benghazi scenario, why didn't she bring those families up? Oh, that's the reason why they're not so willing to forgive and forget. And it's like another thing is too. Here's the thing: the irony of the left. They always want to blame. I remember reading when I was a kid about how they blamed the Vietnam War on Richard Nixon. They call it Nixon's War. They used to have a PBS thing out on that. Nixon's War. Well, they also say, well, Obama inherited Afghanistan and Iraq. That's exactly what came into Nixon's hands when he became the president. It was an ongoing thing, the Vietnam War. So, okay, they put the entire blame and all the atrocities upon Nixon, never Johnson or never Kennedy. Okay, admittedly, and Eisenhower sent troops. And see, I'm willing to acknowledge the Republican role in this, because he sent advisors, no active troops. Kennedy sent the first troops. The first person killed was during the Kennedy administration, and then there was a huge push for it during the Johnson. But okay, now the Democrats always distance themselves from these bad wars. They always put it on the Republicans. Mm-hmm. I mean, I don't like Iraq and Afghanistan. I wasn't convinced that was a good reason to go in those two countries in the first place. I think maybe we should have gone to Afghanistan. Iraq was irrelevant. And I'm so tired of people saying, well, that was a UN resolution that Saddam didn't follow, and they had to go enforce that. Why are the UN's one doing that at that point then, okay? So if the UN is so caring about that, why weren't they on board with it? So, but I mean, the Democrats always distance themselves from the bloodshed and the body count that they created. It's always the Republicans and their warmongering industrial buddies. They're on board for it. Hillary voted for these two wars, yet she's playing. It's so easy to forget their past. I mean, it's like I don't like either party, but it's just like the Republicans. At least, let's face it, Richard Nixon resigned because he felt ashamed. Mm-hmm. These guys don't even have that capability of feeling ashamed for what they do. They don't.
Well, the whole administration we have now was inherited wholesale, lifted up off of his Marines under the Bush administration and handed off to Obama, and his legacy has been that he's been dealing with the Bush administration's excesses for the last 7.5 years. And so when you look for his legacy was in fact to stop everything that was done before him, of which he's not responsible for anything that happened during his own administration. I mean, the left, just is not, having respect for the American people's intelligence, and that's just another indication of that. But in this situation here with this Khizr Kahn, it is really interesting to just watch him from the point he made those statements and pull out and whipped out the Constitution and all of that, and he's reading it and offering it to Donald Trump to read. Never pointed out what passage of it is in fact the pertinent part of the Constitution that should be read, that Donald Trump is in fact missing. And certainly the Constitution does not apply to the people of the world, but to the American people. So when you start talking about the First Amendment, and that Donald Trump has no appreciation of it, in fact, of stopping Muslims from practicing their religion from Saudi Arabia. I mean, they're stopping them before they get here from practicing their religion. I mean, if that's not a flipping of reality in terms of what really is going on in the Middle East, is that the Muslims are the ones that are stopping the Christians from practicing their religion. But they have flipped it in terms of, in this country right here, Donald Trump is trying to stop them from practicing religion. And that's not true. What Donald Trump trying to do is stop the Muslims from coming over here bombing people like they're doing every 90 days. They say 83, but it's really about every 90 days. They have a Muslim uprising in Europe, and every 90 days or so, people are being killed in Europe. And to put America first, which means that we're going to put the American interests first, and we're going to try to prevent that, not by deporting citizens that are Muslims from this country, but in fact realizing that it's impossible to vet Muslims from other parts of the world because they have their own passport press. They are printing their own visas, and we can't identify who these people are that are coming into this country. And one person put it on Facebook this way. They said that if you had 10 poison jelly beans, you put them into a mix of other jelly beans, you don't know which ones are poison, which of the jelly beans are you going to eat? And the analogy was that if you don't know who the jihadists are, but you know the jihadists come from the Muslim population, what do? In terms of the people that are allowed to come into the country, what do you do at that point? If you cannot, in fact, identify the ones that are coming in that want to embrace American, values, and I don't know of any Muslims that are actually willing to do that, quite frankly, that come in from the outside.
I'd like to know this.
I don't know of any Muslims who would do that.
I'd like to know this. And you said this, and I've said this, and you said this repeatedly. There are peaceful practitioners of the Muslim, Islamic religion. There are peaceful observers of that. Mm-hmm. But the book itself that they use as a basis for their faith, the Quran, does say in several passages, okay, at one point it says, do what the people of the book, which are Jews and Christians, do what they do. But don't acknowledge Christ as being the Son of God. He was just a prophet. And our Muhammad's the greatest, basically. So, but another passage, it says, butcher, maim, kill, subjugate, forced taxation, where they have to wear special clothing to denote their lower rank within your midst and all that, and make them feel the punishment until they turn from their ways. Mm-hmm. So how do they reconcile that with coming to a country where that kind of thing is forbidden? How are they going to try to say that once they get their numbers up, that's not going to happen? Yeah. So why should we lower our guard? Let's face it, they're coming from countries that are horrible track record-wise for human rights. How can we? Not that we're glowing. We've done a lot of atrocities against our own people. I'm not going to our peoples, and I don't want to go into that. But at least we try to acknowledge it and move away from it. They will never acknowledge it. Mm-hmm. Their feet is never held to the fire. They never have to acknowledge the atrocities committed in their world by their own religious mentalities.
Mm-hmm. I'm a little bit more extreme on that issue than Donald Trump is. I don't think that Donald Trump goes far enough. His idea is that from those countries that have a jihadist kind of insurgency going on, that he would like to have vetting going on for those Muslims coming out of those areas. I'm a little bit more extreme than that, and I don't think the view, although extreme, is unfair. And that is, I don't think Muslims that are from the Middle East should be in Western countries, and that's because of the lack of congruency in the values of the two meeting. That's why Muslims do not, in fact, integrate into Western societies. You look in Europe, for example, and what you see here is a non-integration of the Muslim population into the countries in which they have immigrated. And when you see that happening repeatedly in all these countries, and it doesn't matter which country you talk about, it can be England, it can be France, it can be Germany, it can be any of the others. And I was in the Netherlands and went through Belgium, and I was watching it and just looking at what was going on there, where they were banning the burqa in France, for example. And I just simply watched the amount of interactiveness that goes on between the two cultures, and what you have here are two cultures that are sitting or that are existing side by side, basically in conflict with each other. Some of the conflict rolls out into violence, which you see breaking out every 90 days or so in Europe, but the tensions are there in those societies before the violence breaks out, because there's no integration of the values of those who come in as immigrants and those who are the indigenous parts of the population. They are endangered by that lack of integration. What Donald Trump has said, I think, is very reasonable. He said that nobody should come into this country unless they are willing to adopt our values and love its people. And I don't think that's an extreme statement at all.
I don't think so. I know. Okay, another thing is World War II. I know a few people who were war brides, and other people came into this country after World War II. One guy was in the Wehrmacht, which is the German army, not the specialist groups that went on there and killed the Nazis. But back then, they had to be vetted. They had to be vetted, and it wasn't because of racism, because they didn't want Nazis in. A few of them did slip through, even though scrutiny they did try to apply at that point, before they even came allowed to immigrate here. Mm-hmm. But there were a few, let's face it, a few former Nazis that were found out they're like leaders of death camps or whatever, and they had to be like extradited to other countries to face trial there. We've had a few of them, more than a handful. So they had scrutiny going on there. But then again, during the war, so much was destroyed, they did, like you said, they had like presses that created passports. They had that going on in Europe too after World War II. Mm-hmm. So I mean, you had great forgers and the documents, and back then it was much easier because they didn't have the holograms and all this other imagery they could embed in the stuff. They didn't have that kind of trackability. So why now, when that stuff is really easily available, why is considered having concern about your safety considered racist or xenophobic? Why is that considered that? I mean, if I go to their country, I can't walk around carrying. I can't bring a weapon in that country. I can't bring a Bible into Saudi Arabia because they fear that's going to be a bad element. But yet Saudi Arabia doesn't take these immigrants because they fear security issues. They're the same. They're the same people. They're the same religion. What are they fearing? Mm-hmm. Yeah.
They won't even allow Muslims to come into Muslim countries. From Syria is Shia, and Saudi Arabia is Sunni. So they have a conflict between the two. They consider each other to be apostates of the religion of Islam, perverting the religion of Islam, because they feel they have the perfect understanding of it and the others do not. And that goes back to the time where the Prophet of Islam died born in 570 and died in 632. And so they have a different view of it based upon their understandings of it, and also the line of descent after the Prophet died, and that right there creates conflict. And it goes very deeply in those cultures where they are, when they say, well, Muslims have slaughtered more Muslims than they slaughtered Christians. Yes, but there's a danger in both domains. And the question is, why would Christians, knowing that the antagonism is even higher between Muslims and Christians, why would Christian nations, or nations that were founded upon a Christian understanding more so than a Muslim understanding, why would they invite the danger into their homeland and expect it to be different there when it's not different where they are existing outside of those Western countries? What does it look like in Syria? But what does it look like in any of the Arab nations? And which of them are open to Christian immigration? So Khizr gets up there, and I began to pay attention to him immediately when I saw what he was doing up there, because I haven't read Robert Spencer's book. And I think everybody should read this book by Robert Spencer called Steph Jihad. It's a very important book to read, to understand jihad in all of its manifestations. It's not all flying planes into buildings. It's not going into places that where persons are disarmed and they try to maximize the killing, because what they're doing is taking the population down. And it won't happen. Rome wasn't built in a day, and it does, and that's not going to happen in a day. But if you continue to make the attacks, then what does that? Where does that lead to? As you are downsizing one population, increasing another population. I mean, one to how many? When they go in there in these jihadist missions, and two people commit suicide on suicide missions, but the death toll is 130. Or the death toll is much more than the suicide, those who commit suicide in the operation. And then the birth rate is another part of it, and where the birth rate is different, and they're growing, their population is growing, and this population is pretty much at not even the replacement level, because you have to replace the replacement level is 2.1 births for every female in the population. If you don't have that, then this lack of equivalency in terms of the numbers over time, you can see the takeover that's taking place just through the demographics.
See, the West has kind of done themselves in by worshiping at this thing of individuality to some degree, and I'm an individualist, but when you don't realize it, if you don't perpetuate your own self, nobody else is going to, and you can't. So. Okay, so the thing is, and you also bought in this, and basically the Americans especially have sold themselves out for material gain. They don't want to worry so much about the kid's future and the college and the braces for the kid and the medical issues and the food and all that stuff that comes with having children. Now, most of us are like adolescents. And I don't have kids, and it wasn't because I just never had the right to person I wanted to even try that stuff with, because I know there's a strain there, and I never got along with somebody that well to try that, okay? But I mean, we all have tried. I mean, we have all seen the failure of the West, because the West is concentrated on materialism. And that's what Solzhenitsyn said that in his address back in the 70s when he addressed the American people. And we did. We have surrendered we forfeited the future because we wanted the baubles now. Everybody else, every other culture, every other group, the generation came before us, those were not options. So we can't say they were morally right. The excess wealth wasn't available to them. But we have surrendered our own having a legacy, because we wanted to have the big screen TVs. We wanted to concern ourselves with going about and having all this fun stuff. And let's face it, the other generation, it was just, they didn't question it. Maybe they probably shouldn't have, because we shouldn't have. We just basically allowed ourselves to be caught up in this materialistic pursuit.
Yeah, John, that is very true. And it's a large part of what is happening in the country right now. And I think that explains to some extent the immigration policies of the country. If the population is not replacing itself, it then opens up a corridor to the immigration to bring about that replacement, but the replacement is not the same people on the soil. It's a replacement that goes on for a variety of reasons, where the population that's indigenous is being replaced by a non-indigenous population. And that goes on. I think Melano has a very good understanding of that, and he talks about it in one of his tapes. This philosopher from Canada, Stefan Melano, and he raised a question in one of his tapes. And that question is, what do you do, what do politicians do when they're no longer able to sell the people that are indigenous to the country on the American dream, because they are siphoning off the American dream through the indebtedness that they've incurred by creating a welfare state? And what do they sell when they cannot sell these ideas of giving people other people's stuff, because other people don't have any stuff for them to take? They've already decimated the middle class, for example. So what do they do? And what Melano says is what they sell in that case is that they sell citizenship. And so you can see how that plays into the immigration arena. You just bring in another population, and then you sell them not on goods, but you sell them the remnants of a fading system. The one that's going out is capitalism, so the fumes of that, you can sell them, and you sell them the citizenship, and you proselytize among that element of the population. That's what the Democratic Party is pretty much depending on. And that's why I think Khizr Kahn is on that stage.
Another thing is another observation I made too is that the ancient Rome basically started accepting more people to fight in their battles because they couldn't. Their own population was unable or unwilling to go into the military, and they were buying themselves away from that. So they allowed people to purchase their freedom, being enslaved peoples, by going in the military. Now we've increased this. The allowance of people who are foreign nationals to serve in our military.
Yeah.
Okay. So count towards citizenship. The thing is, we're not learning from the past, and the other thing is too, we're not actually looking at the crux of the issue. The basis of the issue is we keep on doing military involvement where we are eroding our troop strength, either by losses or by because they just they just fall away. They retire and they can't replace them fast enough, and some people have to be recalled and stuff to be served more terms, and they tours and stuff. So we're not looking at this. I mean, another thing is this bizarre notion that we have that everybody is equal. Everybody, one group of people is just as good as the other. That one set of mindset is just as good or as equal as the other. That's a load of crap. It's a load of crap.
Major problem. All cultures, the idea that all cultures are the same is one of the biggest bugaboos that we have to deal with and put down. It's almost like insurrectionary to advocate that, because what it does, it undermines the culture. Because when you have this assumption, and it's a very dangerous assumption, that all cultures are equal and that they should therefore have even outcomes, and when the outcomes are not even, since the assumption is that they are all equal and even in their input, then whenever the outcomes are not even and equal, therefore the reason that you have to import then as an explanation is that discrimination against those groups explains why the outcomes are so different. And this is an argument that is undermining the integrity of the country, because all cultures are not equal. And when you import cultures where the IQ, and I was arguing this over a friend's house this past weekend where he just couldn't get it. When you import people with different IQ levels from low IQ countries, not that the countries, IQs are never the same at any point in time in any time in any place in history throughout the history of the world. And I was reading, as a matter of fact, this weekend I was reading this to a friend's at a friend's house, which was a document called 15 Things You Did Not Know About the Moors in Spain. And when you look at the Moors in Spain, when they went into Spain in 711 AD, what they met in Europe was a very primitive society in the Iberian Peninsula called the Andalus by the Visigoths. So when they went there in 711, their culture they brought in from the northern part of Africa, and the Moorish culture they had in terms of the Arab influence. When they went into Europe, looking at the 15 things that we didn't know about the Moors in Spain, they met primitive, cultural references. But since IQ and intelligence is not rooted in any paradigm, that it can be manipulated, by effort and things of that sort. And the way I see it is that they say, is it nature or is it nurture? It is both. And you have it kind of interfacing like this, nature having one aspect, and then there's the nurturing that has one aspect, and they keep influencing each other, and you begin to have a higher placement of cultures that once were low and then become high, and then become high and then become low. And what explains the flip-flop that you see it throughout history, as stated in the book written by Count C.F. Voney, in Ruins of Empire, what explains one empire going up and one going down is the one that's up becomes you take a picture of it and you focus on that culture being great. It gives the other culture that are not that great something to aspire to. The other culture that has already aspired to that level has no such picture of one that aspires higher than it is. It becomes complacent, and these cultures are now energized, and they aspire to that, overcome that, and go above that level. And you see this going on throughout history. I'm not saying it's static. I'm saying that, and I argue that at no time have cultures ever been equal any time in history. You see it. You see the. You go back and look at all the cultures that have taken over other cultures, and you see this interplay. And you try to explain why the interplay goes on. Some cultures become dominant, then become less dominant, and they fall. In fact, in John G. Jackson's book, and I just make this as a QTA point in running, in John Jackson's book, the question is asked at the beginning of this book called it's called Introduction to African Civilization, which is a 1970 addition to the book that he and Willis Huggins wrote in 1937 in a much smaller book. But Huggins died, had an alcohol problem, and he's not there when he writes the book in 1970. Does a much larger version of it. But in the book that they wrote in the book he wrote, in the Chancellor Williams wrote, I should say Chancellor Williams wrote, called Destruction of Black Civilization. He asked the question, what happened to Sumerian civilization? And the Sumerian legend is that, they lost their history, so they died. Now, I read that, but what I read into it is that they got lazy and they lost their cultural reference point and they lost their energy and they died. Because when you become complacent in a culture, then you set the paradigm in place for all the cultures that were once your inferior to overtake you and to then come in as a conqueror of the culture, because they become at some point greater, because they are now aspiring to that level and they exceed that level, and then they come in as a dominant force to overtake the culture they were once in fact inferior to. In other words, inferior cultures have always been on the planet, but they've not always been the same cultures that are inferior. And to say all cultures are the same is one of the big mistakes people make, because they do not understand why differences exist, and they think it's because discrimination explains the difference, and that's not true. So I'm for putting America first, and for America being first and staying first, but America has to understand why it is first and why it may not be first in the future if it continues to go down this road where they listen to these people get up there in front of them, as it happened last week at the Democratic National Convention, and they're saying all kinds of things, and very little of what they said last week at that convention is true. And there were a lot of converging. There were a lot of interests that were converging, that are divergent interests that were converging because they're to come together to meet a common objective. But the objective at the end will be one in which each group believes it will be the last one standing once it arrives at the objective. The objective is to bring about a different result than we have right now. And both groups, a lot of groups as a matter of fact, socialists, communists, the Muslim group and others, and anti-capitalist groups, those who feel in the burn, all of them have different reasons of why they're coming together to join into changing the paradigms in place right now. But it does not mean that once the paradigm is changed that they're all going to be on the same side at that point, because they're on the same side right now, but for different outcomes. So the unity is one to bring about a different result than what now exists. But in the end game, there will be this divergence that you'll see, because they're coming together to achieve different ends. The Muslims are under what I saw Kahn doing last week. In fact, one of my friends called me before I came to the studio today, and they were saying that they heard this program that had Brigitte Gabriel on, and they've traced this guy, Kahn, and they have found him to be somewhat connected to the Muslim Brotherhood. Now, before that was even told to me, I saw that connection through what was going on in the aftermath of his speeches at the DNC last week, because this guy's been in the media ever since. And now he wants the Republican Party to repudiate Donald Trump. What he really wants is to defeat Donald Trump, because Hillary Clinton has claimed that she's going to bring in a whole lot more Muslims, and they're going to continue to transition this population out of its orbit of what has been in the past, and put another paradigmatic population and demographic in place, so that the objective they have, which is to in fact transform the country. I think I heard somebody say that in 2008, that change has come to America. and to transform the country from that which it was not intended to be and never was into something different. And you cannot do that if you're not acting clandestinely to bring about the result. And they're doing it, some of it, they're doing it to bring another population in the country that already has this totalitarian, impulse. And they're bringing that population on the soil as well. So a lot of things are going on that we need to pay attention to. And I paid a lot of attention to Khizr Kahn after he made his comments. I've been watching him ever since in terms of being in the public, and he hasn't gone away yet. And that let me see that there's an activist that is in the works. And now I'm hearing through, I told a friend of mine to send me the tape of this one program he said listen to this morning, which had Bridget Gable on there, and they were tracing this guy to the Muslim Brotherhood. I wasn't surprised to hear that, because I heard that throughout that speech. I do not believe for one moment that this guy is carrying around the Constitution inside his inside coat pocket and just happened to whip it out and wanted Donald Trump to read his copy of the Constitution.
So you don't have to do that because you got it memorized.
I got it memorized.
So it's like
I don't have to do that, but I know he has memorized it and he hasn't read it.
Well, another thing is too. So it's Valerie Jarrett. She actually said one time that she found the Constitution and the Bill of Rights is a good way for her to make her inroads into this country. Valerie Jarrett is the one that connected heavily to Obama's administration. A radical, for all practical purposes, I think she's a communist, or she's also a Muslim and mixed in there somehow. I don't know how you can be both, but one's godless, the other one's really emphasizes God or Allah. So, So I mean, I don't.
She's Iranian, but she and she has a Muslim background. Doesn't mean that she's a practitioner of the religion. She is a communist, and she is one of those persons in there with a foreign view that has nothing to do with the strictures that have made this country great. And that's why this undermining is going on in that administration.
Kissinger was a lot like that too, though. Kissinger was a foreigner who also had kind of an ironic view of the United States. He didn't really appreciate it. He didn't really love this country. He used it to his end, but he was a lot like that, in my opinion. He was a lot like this person.
We've been on this course to a larger or less extent based on which party is in power, but the course has not changed. You probably noticed, John, that whichever party is in power, the course that we're going, the road we're going down, the pathway that's been strewn in front of us, not strewn with roses, but simply the people that are carrying us down this road, they may be at a different rate in which they are moving us toward this cliff, but both parties are moving us toward the cliff.
Well, but some people say, though, you got to understand that this can't be, there's anti-conspiracy then. And it sounds far-fetched that somebody was so prescient, they can actually sit out there 40 years, 50 years down the road and look and see how to manipulate things to their advantage all that way. But then again, here's another thing you can look at it, frame it this way. If you're in power already, you want more power, or you already have some power, you want to gradually gain it, you do it under the radar. And that's exactly what these people have done. They talk about stealth jihad, connection to the Islamic people, but if you look at the communists, they've been doing it for years by gradually introducing things that they think are beneficial, and the American people are sold on it to some degree, but then they don't fully see what down the road they basically drilled so many holes in their boat it's sinking. They're no longer safe. They're frantically trying to tread water to save above water. So basically, we've allowed this to go in. It's like the analogy they use all the time about the frog in the water. You boil it not by just throwing it in a boiling pot. You gradually increase the temperature until he's boiled. We've allowed this because every time somebody raised a question about it, they're dismissed as hacks or wackos or whatever. Oh, come on, you have always seen that. In the sitcoms, anybody who questioned stuff or label anybody as a communist or anything, they were mocked. Well, they basically used this coercive measure. You don't want to be labeled as a nut job, so they prevented people from asking questions out loud, at least, by labeling them anybody, your nut job, a wacko, a wing nut. That's a good one they always do, wing nut. Guess what? Eventually, sometimes afoot, when you see all these people who are saying that are all in the same camp.
Yeah, John, I agree that there are certain things that will happen because in the pursuit of power, there's never enough power, and so you continue to pursue it. The power that you had, you want more. But I think that where most persons, many people who are looking at why things operate the way they operate, they get outside of what the framers are trying to prevent and do not understand it within the mindset of the framers who understood power very, very well. That's why they were trying to disaggregate it and put it under restrictions and restrain it by, in fact, having a dispersal of power, for example, through the three branches of government, then disaggregated in terms of the federal level and the state level, putting watchdogs in place and trying to make sure each of the parties that were to be assigned in Articles 1, 2, and 3, where you set up the legislative, the executive, and the judicial branches of government, you would in fact make them jealous of the turf in which has been assigned to them by the Constitution, and they're so jealous of the turf that they will not in fact, coagulate the power, and they would begin to cooperate in terms of this takeover that we're seeing right now. I don't cater to the idea that it's conspiratorial. It's just how power operates.
I say there's an element, not like a long group like the Burger Builders or all that. Mm-hmm. That's fun to entertain those thoughts, but I mean, I just think basically they're political parasites or political opportunists, and I certainly think that's what it is. I think Obama's a perfect example of an opportunist. I mean, he's a schmoozer. He knows how to talk to people. He knows he's basically a snake oil salesman. He knows what people want to hear, and he knows how to make it believable. It makes him seem like he's one of them. He's never been one of them, but they're convinced that he is.
Barack Obama, and I'll say this on the air, is one of the biggest frauds in American history, and his presidency was bound to fail because his presidency was not immersed in anything this country has represented in the past that made it great, and by standing outside of that which made it great, and he certainly stands outside of it, it was doomed to fail because the things he's trying to do have not ever worked anywhere else in history.
I think it's actually a success. It's exactly what he wanted. Gotten.
And what he's trying to do, and what his intent is certainly successful because his intent was never make America great. He's never used those words. If you notice, by the way, that when Donald Trump's biggest problem is that he has said he wants to make America great again. John, I don't know if you noticed this at the Democratic Convention. Those that have been railing against the country for the last 7.5 years, I'm talking about Eric Holder, for example. I couldn't believe that he would, close down the left side of his mouth and talk on the right side. And he was saying, Donald, do you hear me? America is already great. Folks, let me ask you something. Do you think that's been Eric Holder's message? When Eric Holder was Attorney General, I was glad to see him when he got out of there. But do you think Eric Holder's message was America was great? Now that Donald Trump is running, all of a sudden America is great. And there was a bum up there in his speech. Oh, just simply celebrating. The man had said in 2015, that was just 1 year ago, that America was racist, had racism in its DNA. And I don't know how you put that in your DNA. In other words, what he's saying is that if you're white, that in the lack of, what he really was saying is what the college professors are saying in some of these classes, that the absence of melanin, that the fact that melanin makes you more human, and therefore the absence of melanin, or not that melanin is ever absent completely, but in terms of it being recessive, then in the DNA there is this racism. So when you see a white face, you're seeing a racist. I mean, they may not say it explicitly, but that's the idea that they're coming from. And that's also why people are shooting at people. They had one incident over there in one place, and then 5 police officers get killed in Dallas. One of them was black, but they were shooting the white police officers. That's what this guy said. And the idea comes out of, if you're white, the racism is there because you're white. But nobody's doing the profiling here, and don't get the impression that's profiling because that's on the left.
I wonder if
only the right profile.
I wonder if I could go to a black country or a bunch of whites land in a white country, and could we be as critical of them as the blacks and the black leadership and the black groups are of white people, and still be tolerated?
Would not be tolerated. One guy told me when I was in Cleveland, I talked to a person from Senegal, and I was in Senegal 4 days, basically against my will. I couldn't get out of the country. I was in Senegal in 2009. I go through Senegal quite a bit though, but I'm just there temporarily. I'm way to another part of the African landscape. But I've gone through Senegal, and I've been in Senegal. I was in there 4 days locked in because I was trying to find a way to, in fact, navigate out of the country. because I couldn't go back to the country I come from to get in Senegal, so I had to figure it out. And I was sure that I was going to figure it out, but it took some time for me to do so. Because I was going around the country at that time, and I knew exactly what this guy was telling me when I was in Cleveland about Senegal. He said this. He said that first of all, he told me I don't get blacks in this country. And he said they complain, and here's all this opportunity they have, and they're around here acting like there's no opportunity. He said if they complain like in my country, as they complain here, they would be visited at night, and the next day they would not be complaining because they would not be around. And that's how they handle dissidents in other countries. They just simply do it through a elimination process. And if you're up there complaining and you're showing that you are a problem to the security and safety and tranquility of the country, then they just simply absent your presence, and therefore that problem is resolved. They're not going to tolerate in these countries a certain amount of dissidence, which they see as destabilizing the societies. And I've seen a lot of it. I've been in a lot of countries where when, for example, the press would say something that is not palatable to the peace, safety, and order of the society based upon how the leadership is willing it, and they write these articles on the front page of the newspaper, and they'll say, we were not intend to be disrespectful, Mr. Presidente, and so on and so forth, because they realize the consequences of that. And there are certain things that they cannot say, and things that they have to say, at least in public. And even in private, you don't know who you're talking to. And I've seen this paranoia in talking to people in the citizenry. I've been at tables with people in certain countries. I'm simply sitting here talking from a reference base. If I can say this for the country I come from, and they can't say it there, and I'm just assuming the freedoms are the same. We're sitting there having, breakfast maybe, and the guy says to me, we're not supposed to talk about that.
They're like Thailand. If you criticize a king, you could face prison. And so that's an Asian culture, and it's a decent country from all. The people aren't massively oppressed, but there's been social movements been put down and stuff. Some attempts at reform has been put down, but they do seem to be more. They're not really brutal as much as the other countries have been. But then again, this is a homogenous population largely, and they don't allow criticism within groups. Could you imagine? Now they're basically, it could be viewed at if a white leader or a white person were to say this about blacks or Mexicans or any other group, that's considered now pointing them to be out to be potential victims or targets. But yet, a person like Obama, like Eric Holder, all these other people can turn around and make broad sweeping generalizations about white people. And we're just actually supposed to sit there and take that as like a means to stimulate our soul searching even further. But no, we're not supposed to fear that. We're not supposed to have any questions about that. We're just supposed to see it as, wow, isn't that great? They corrected me in my errors, even though you might not be living in an error. So, I don't understand how they got this. If I criticize something going on in the black community, shut up, you don't know what's going on. But yet they can make judgment on me. They don't know my scenario.
Yeah, and I stand against them for doing that because, you take a lot of heat for it. I'm willing to see. I'm a little bit different than a lot of people because I welcome the heat. People think they can intimidate me. And they get on Facebook sometimes. They make these derogatory comments. That emboldens me because I know know this. I know what I'm talking about, and I know they don't know what they're talking about. And they try to stand you down through hollering and through emotion. And that may work with some persons, but it doesn't work here. And I have some former students who think they're qualified. One of my former students got on Facebook the other day in the private chat and said, I want to apologize to you, Mr. Moss, because, I said blah, 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 blah. And I don't, you don't need to apologize to me because I didn't take that stuff personally. I knew that they were wrong. And it didn't move me not in the least. And the apology is not necessary because it doesn't have any effect upon me. I'm going to state the truth. I don't care how many witnesses I have to it. I don't need any witnesses to it. The truth doesn't need a witness. And so I take a lot of positions that are unpopular, and I take this position right here in terms of the white-black thing. There are always times in history where there are populations that are not expendable, and there are always populations that are expendable. That if they're in fact no longer there, nobody would miss them, and that was true at one time of the Greeks. When the Egyptians were the ascendant group. at the point where the Greeks were not ascendant members of the group, and the Romans had not risen up at that point, which that would not be until after 754. There were no Romans in history before 754 BC. And so, if you go back and look at the time when the Greeks were children, and that's what the Greeks were being called by the Egyptians. They said the Greeks, the one thing about you Greeks, you're children. Well, they were children, but they didn't stay children. But at that point in time, if the Greeks were not on the scene, nobody would miss that, because they were not making contributions they would make later on. And if anybody thinks that that whites in the world are an expendable part of the population, I would just ask you this question here: what group would you like to take their place? You see, I'm interrogating these understandings because these understandings do not understand the historical record. And I do understand the blind spot, because I was in that blind spot myself at one point, just looking at dates, looking at events, and not interrogating why those events happened at that point in time to those particular individuals, and why did it happen at that point where it took place. And I had to begin to understand a larger way in which history teaches our lessons. And the lessons are that there are certain groups that are consequential at certain points in time. And that group today, and I don't know why Europe doesn't understand that it's prescient moment in history, and is in fact throwing that away. But those of the European descent are the most indispensable members of the population on the planet right now. And I know people don't like me saying that, but I tell you what they cannot do. They cannot prove it wrong. And I would ask them this question: what group on the planet right now would you like to see removed, where things would be better if that group was in fact removed? And if the European group is expendable and they are the ones that can be dispensed with at this moment in history, then why are all the other groups going into the places where the Europeans are unable to create that where they are the lifestyle that they're looking for? They're looking for it in Europe. And if the Europeans are so bad, then the question becomes then, why are all groups aspiring to be a part of that rather than being a part of where they're from? I would say this to the Muslims. And this is particularly what I say to Khizr Kahn, the one up there speaking of bringing out the document and saying that he's read it and so on and so forth. Would you pull out the document that would in fact validate Sharia law and pull it out as a paradigmatic, understanding that we ought to all have, that would in fact get people, embrace people around that document? Or is that one of racial and cultural exclusion? Let me also say this to you, Mr. Kahn, you mentioned a word there. It went by a lot of folks who were not going to buy if Europeans had said, and that is that you said that Donald Trump has a black heart. You really said he has a black soul. Let me tell you about that term that you use, which shows you underneath it the aggression that you're speaking from that would not be detected by those who are not as studied as some of us are. And I do claim to be one of the persons more studious than many. Not than all, but many, the great majority. Your use of the word black soul has a resonance in Arab culture that needs to be explained. For example, I sit under the #1 writer, novelist in the Arab world, a woman from Egypt by the name of Nawal El-Saadawi. And I was in a seminar for 2 weeks under her tutelage, but I kept reading her novels, and I noticed in her earlier writings that there was this racism coming through in her writings. And I asked her about it in one of the sessions. And here's what she told me. These were her earlier writings, not her later writings, when she had become more westernized, which is to say, quite frankly, more civilized. You may not like that either, but that's also the gospel truth. And I asked her about that racism that I was detecting in her novel, and she said this to me. She says, you're quite right. When I was writing in my earlier writings, that was something that came through in my writing. She said that Arab culture is so racist. These are her words. Now on page 93 of Brigitte Gabriel's book called They Must Be Stopped, on page 93 of that book, she talks about, she raised a question. She asked the question, why is there no black culture in Arab countries? It's certainly not because there was no Arab slave trade, because the Arab slave trade preceded the slave trade that was engaged in where Europeans were participants in it. And it should be rightfully called, when they were participants in it, it should be called what Bester Davidson calls it. In the book, they changed from the book called Black Mother, and he changed the title later on to call it the African slave trade. He's correct in doing that. It is incorrect to call it the European slave trade. It's the African slave trade in the hands of people on the African continent, never in the hands of the European, because they didn't have the firepower to go in and do so. But before the European arrived in that slave trade in 1441, the Arab slave trade would have occurred in the 7th century, starting around 639, when they went into Egypt from Saudi Arabia. And they began to go across the Madrid being from Egypt all the way across northern Africa to Morocco. And when setting up that trade, you would begin to see a decline of the African presence, not only in the Arab world, but see a decline of the African population in the Arab world in Africa. And none of the leadership in the Arab world is African. Bridget is talking about that. But when Khizr Kahn, Kubla Khan, and Genghis Khan, all of it together, when he said that Donald Trump has a black soul, that didn't resonate with a lot of folks, and it was simply looked over and glossed over by a lot of people. Nobody made a comment about it, but that has resonance if you understand the Arab culture, which is very racist, and I've seen it operating everywhere I've been in Africa. It's a very racist culture, and that explains some of the exclusionary aspects of Islam in terms of its treatment of others who are unlike it, because it's not only unlike the Muslims, but it's also unlike the Arabs. Understand that. So he talked about the black soul, but on page 93 of Gabriel's book, it talks about the word abed. Abed in Arabic has two different meanings. And the meaning that it has, that is synonymous with, the meaning of the word abed means slave, but is also interchangeable with the word black. So when he said that he has a black soul, it comes out of the Arabic understanding of black. Because the word black and slave is the same in Arabic culture. And so he was coming out of a racist proposition that was not detected, because people do not assign racism to groups other than to whites. They don't even assign it to blacks. I assign it wherever it is. And any one thing in this should not be assigned to blacks. In this day and time, you're not paying attention. Because Black Lives Matter is not responding to anybody that's made a claim that black lives do not matter. And where black lives do not matter the most is in the black community. And they ain't there. And so that's something that needs to be looked at as well. But Khizr Kahn needs to be watched right now. I'll be doing a second part of a post I did today. I did on my Facebook, part 1. I'm doing a 3-part series here. And part 2 of the series is going to be on Khizr Kahn, because I want to go into his premonition a little bit more deeply. And you'll be reading about that tomorrow. Go read part 1 today. It's on Facebook. I'm the George Moss. Okay, well, we got to get out of here, because, as we do, we tend to get very long-winded, and we try to be thorough, though. But I want you to watch these developments that are taking place, because you're looking at something right now in the laboratory that you need to pay attention to, and be smart enough to understand that we got to get past the Rubicon to arrive at the other end, on the other side, to where we need to be going as a nation, and arrive to our true destination, not the one being assigned to us by the politicians. Okay, we got to get out of here. Until next week, I want you to follow your dream, because if you don't follow your dream, you will never know what's on the other side of the rainbow.